So welcome to WU,
Thank you.
and thank you for kind of being available for this conversation. Could you tell us a little bit about the university you're coming from?
Toronto, yeah. It's the first thing about the University of Toronto is how big it is. It's hard to get my head around it. We have over 80,000 students spread across 3 campuses, and we cover the full range of disciplines, including a full range of professions. It's largely a commuter university. The bulk of the students come from the Toronto area, but increasingly coming from overseas. So I think the figures are on about 20% of the students are now coming in from internationally, which is a new development for us. Yeah.
And you yourself work in which kind of segment of the university?
Physically, I'm located at one of the outlying campuses. It's about 25 kilometres from the centre of the central campus, and I teach in the in the business area.
Obviously, you're a seasoned academic, and when
Meaning I'm old.
Yeah, well, this is the polite Austrian way of putting this fact. And when you kind of look back at your career, on the one hand, what initially drew you into academia, and again, looking back and taking stock. Is there any advice you can give young people thinking about joining academia?
Other than to learn from my mistakes?
Maybe, yeah.
Yes. What drew me into it in the first place? Well, initially it was, I was a child of the 60s, and in those days science was the great thing, and so we all just stumbled into doing PhDs in whatever science we'd been trained in. Mine was chemistry. And I'm a bit of a slow learner, so it took me until halfway through my PhD before I realised I didn't really want to be a research chemist. And so I took a break from that and went into the chemical industry for a few years. But there were things nagging at me while I was there. I was fascinated by the way the organisation I was part of was operated and was run, and the two aren't the same. And the opportunity arose for complicated reasons for me to step off the escalator again and go and do, in my case, start an MBA. And then I was lucky enough to get some money to get involved in some research. And when I looked at the terms of the money, it said I had to be registered for a research degree. So whoops, how did I get here? So I found myself doing another PhD, and this time in management, and specifically in the area of careers. And so I just got very interested in the way what the institution I was part of, Manchester Business School, was doing, and I just got absorbed by the place and never really escaped.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any lessons to learn, as you said, either from your mistakes or from things that you said, yeah, well, this is something I would do all over again?
Yeah, the mantra I always work with is enlightened opportunism. Things come along. They present themselves. That's the way life is. And before you grab them, think about it. You can't see everything that's going to happen. You can't work out all the possibilities. But there are some sort of fairly basic questions you can ask about whether this is are there sort of red flags all over this thing, or should I give it a try? And that's the enlightened bit.
Mm-hmm. 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 In terms of your line of work, what are things, areas, questions, problems that currently you see as the most fascinating one? What, as some people say, what keeps you awake at night?
There's lots of things that keep me awake at night, a lot of them to do with the institute I'm running, but on the scholarly side, I think I've always been at heart a theoretician. Partly that's, I suppose, my innate laziness. It's so much easier to sit and play around ideas than have to rush around the world and do research. That's hard work. but I mean, what really fascinates me at the moment is the project we're working on, which is trying to get a handle on what it is that we're talking about when we talk about career scholarship, because it means everything to everybody, and that isn't a terribly helpful statement, particularly if you're trying to do things like edit handbooks in the subject. So answering the question, what do we mean by the statement that we do research in careers, and if we can think of a set of explanations for which do come up with a satisfying explanation, what can we do with that? How might it help people to make their discovery, or is it just a statement that we make and say yes, okay, fine, next? I don't think it is, but that's the fun with which in a scholarly sense keeps me awake at night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you clearly have been part of at least two different academic environments. One in the UK, you mentioned Manchester Business School, and one in Canada, the University of Toronto. Again, if you kind of look at the developments over the past decade or even decades, is there anything that you can observe in the terms of changing for the better or the worse? I mean, always depending on which measure you take, what kind of maybe fills you with hope and what fills you maybe with some kind of skepticism?
Well, the thing that fills me with hope is the easiest one of all. I meet the most amazingly bright young people coming into the profession now, and I just watch them and I think, I couldn't do that. So that's the hope bit. Really bright people asking interesting questions, and I hope we'll carry on asking interesting questions. And that brings me to the bit that worries me, which is I hope that we don't make life too difficult for them to be able to do that. Because what's happened in the years, very obviously in the years since I started, is that for all kinds of reasons, and a lot of them to do with, but not all of them, to do with increasingly scarce resources to fund education, life is getting so much more difficult for young people starting in the educational scene. If I look at my own institution, the standard that people have to meet in order to be able to get what we refer to as tenure, which is essentially pass your probationary period, is almost impossibly high. It involves publishing papers in journals that don't publish anybody's papers unless you're unbelievably lucky. Where the rejection rates have an astonishing high. And rejection rates are a little bit misleading, of course, because you wouldn't believe the junk that journals get, as well as the good stuff they get. And the demands this puts on young people as they try to get established in the field, and the damage it may be doing to the other bit of their life, which is equally important, which is their private life, their families, their friends. That's the worrying bit. On top of which, the anxiety that jurisdictions now have about what they're getting from their universities is leading them to demand more of universities that universities don't feel that they were necessarily set up to do. Universities have a particular view about what their mission is, which isn't consistent necessarily with this notion that we're here to, we go to university in order to get a job. Now, people who say that misread history, of course, because a very large part of the German education system was precisely done for that reason. And it's easy to forget that, and that's what professional schools always were about. Nevertheless, there's another side to universities which is about the life of the mind, developing people who have breadth to their thinking, who become outstanding citizens in all kinds of other ways. That could easily get lost in this rush for applicability. And I understand why jurisdictions put the universities under these pressures, because everybody has fiscal problems these days, and so you're always looking for where I can get more bang for my buck, and preferably for fewer bucks than before. So where this one ends, I don't know. It's an exciting time in some respects because people are experimenting with new pedagogy, technologies for pedagogy. Some of them will fall by the wayside. Some of them won't. We don't really know yet, but you don't know till you try. And hope we hope that these will produce better experiences for our kids going through the system. We won't know till it's happened, and maybe not even then. So it's an exciting time from that point of view, because in many ways the traditional educational model, at least as it's seen in universities, particularly in North America, is essentially broken. It depends on expensive faculty standing up in front of very large numbers of students, and are they getting anything from it? Probably not. As the university has less funds to play with, and the people standing up in front become fewer and fewer of them are the kind of people that you and I are lucky enough to be, namely tenured faculty. They're people brought in to teach that particular class, the so-called the precarious employment group, and that's a natural consequence of the way in which university budgets are being stretched. So that's a cause for real concern, and so part of me is full of hope and part of me is full of worry.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know that you are quite frequently in Europe and have at least some knowledge about what goes on at the European scene. Is there anything that you would say Europe, whatever that exactly is, but Europe could learn in academic terms from the North American system? Some things we should maybe import, and some things we might want to be kind of staying away?
The scary thing is how much the European schools, and for the purposes of the exercise I'll include my old country, Britain. I know it has this uneasy relationship. Is it European, isn't it? It's scary to see how the European universities have gone for all that's worst in North American education. This passion for ranking everything in sight, which just wasn't about in the days before, when I left Britain at the end of the 80s, and it really wasn't on the agenda then, but it is now. And as part of this, the passion for quantifying everything in sight, it isn't a contribution to the literature unless it's in an A journal, whatever an A journal is, and so we have to desperately try and rank the journals and say it's worth publishing there, and it's not worth publishing there, even though most things are read by somebody, and you never know till later who's read what, who's actually came across something you wrote and you just tossed it off and you didn't really think anything of it, and they say, wow, I found that really helpful, and it was something that it certainly wasn't an end quote A journal, and it wasn't and you never intended you never expected it to make a contribution, but it did. So this passion for quantifying and pushing everybody into the top journals, which can't take it all anyway, I find profoundly destructive. Mm-hmm. And I wish you hadn't learned from the North Americans there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Kind of as a closing remark, when you come from multicultural city like Toronto and kind of the very large country in North America to this tiny speck in the heart of Europe called Austria and Vienna. Anything that and View, so anything that kind of you find remarkable when you do this transition for the better or the worse?
Oh well, I mean, what you have and North America doesn't have is a history and a culture, which means that it's just such a fascinating place to visit. The way my wife puts it is that, and she was talking about England in this particular instance, you never know when you're driving through the countryside, you turn the corner and there's this gorgeous 10th century or 11th century church. We don't have any of that. What we do have in common with Austria is that Canada doesn't matter to the world either. And I always find that very reassuring. I like being somewhere which doesn't matter, because that way I can get on with things and not worry about what the rest of the world thinks. So I always love coming here. Toronto's fascinating because 50% of the 50% of the population was born outside Canada. So you're right. It's a fascinating place. It's always interesting to come to somewhere which isn't like that, which has a much clearer sense of who it is, and a much clearer sense of its history and of its culture, which the rest of the world lives off. And so what's so great about here is to come to the origin of everything that I've been living off for decades before. That's the fascination, particularly of Vienna.
Thank you for kind of sharing your thoughts and insight, and all the best.
Thank you.